Another person of a noted background, George Washington, a young man of 21, went west through Virginia to the Ohio country in 1853 to purportedly get the French out of what he felt was Virginia territory. And when he was in this area, he looked at maps of what we now call the state of Ohio, and he saw something that really caught his eye, that he saw river systems that went up to a divide, a hydrographic divide, we call it the Portage Path in Akron, Ohio, and river systems that went down from there, the Muskingum, the Tuscarawas, to the Ohio River. And he speculated this was a tremendously important potential trade route between the Great Lakes and the Ohio River system. So that was in Moses Cleveland's mind when he decided where he was going to land. And landed here, and the river and the lake became the center of Cleveland. They were initially, believe it or not, the river was an impediment to settlement. The mouth was blocked by sandbars. The old riverbed, which separates Whiskey Island, was slow flowing. It was malarial. Early settlers came down with what they called the ague. They tried to dose it with whiskey. They did not have Great Lakes beer at that point. They moved out to the ridgeline to a place called Newburgh. Cleveland was so pathetic in its early growth that in a gazetteer in 1810, it was described as a small settlement near Newburgh. Now, Newburgh, for those of you who don't know the area, is Broadway and Harvard, where I grew up, so I'm rather proud of that. But eventually, those visions of the future would come to fruition, and they came, I dare say, by virtue of a state and federal stimulus package. In the 1820s, the federal government finally provided money to clear the sandbars at the mouth of the Cuyahoga River. And in 1825, the state began construction on a huge infrastructure project, the Ohio and Erie Canal. And when that was completed in 1832, Cleveland on the shore of Lake Erie was connected with Portsmouth on the Ohio River. Now, you've got to think of that in a broader perspective, because you can go from Le Havre to New York and up the Hudson to Albany, and by water on the new Erie Canal from Albany to Buffalo, and I'm not going to sing the song, and then through the Great Lakes to Cleveland, down through the canal to the Ohio River to Cincinnati to St. Louis, and eventually to the Gulf of Mexico. So by the 1830s, Cleveland was on a global transportation route, and it prospered. And so that's the way they viewed it. They viewed water as agricultural for drinking, but as transport and economically important. It was a resource to be used. And that's how it was used. The river became the city's artery. And it attracted people who were entrepreneurial, one of whom was a young man named John D. Rockefeller. And Rockefeller initially became a commodities merchant. His office was in the flats, and that's where commodities came in, were reshipped, sold as retail. He became wealthy. And then he found another commodity coming out of the ground in Pennsylvania called oil, created Standard Oil. He needed water for his refinery. He needed a shipping area. So he decided to settle on a tributary of the Cuyahoga, Kingsbury Run, and that was the industrialization of the river. And that was the history of that river. It's still the history of the river, but it was the history of the river for over 150 years. And as the river industrialized, it changed. It became transport. It became a place where effluent would go. It became so polluted that it was disgusting. But those industries attracted people to Cleveland, and that put another emphasis on water. Where do you get water for drinking? Initially, it wasn't from the lake, it wasn't from the river, it was from wells. Cleveland's first drawing of water from the lake actually began in 1856 with our first waterworks. And we have continued to take water from the lake, but let me read some figures for you that might tell you what was happening. Let me give you a couple figures. Cleveland grew rapidly. 606 people in 1820, 300,000 in 1900, 800,000 in 1920 when it was the fifth largest city in the United States. And everybody drank, and it wasn't just beer.
Sorry.
But that, that's but getting water from the lake. Let me just give you these figures. The intake tunnel that was built in 1856 was 300 feet long. The next tunnel, built in 1874, was 6,600 feet long. The next one, which was built in 1890, was 9,117 feet long. The last one of the last ones built in 1896, was 26,000 feet long. And what's happening? The river was dumping so much pollutant into the lake that we had to go further and further out into the lake for clean water. And that was because people were drinking water The water was going back into the soil. We were finally getting sewage systems. The industries were pouring effluent into the river. It was, as Mayor Rensselaer Herrick called it in 1881, it was an open sewer running through the city. But did we care? No, because we were in competition for jobs in industry. And a lot of us looked in Cleveland in the 1880s toward Pittsburgh. And the Pittsburghians were doing the same thing, the Monongahela and Allegheny. And if you're going to get ahead, you would use that river. So the pollution was rife. We have got some great stories. I have to watch my time, but they're immigrant stories. What was it like to enter Cleveland into this industrial booming metropolis in the late 19th century that was based on water? We have a story of a Czech blacksmith named Frank Wilczek. He actually became a very important industrialist in Cleveland. But he arrived in Cleveland in the 1870s. His family members who were already here say, Frank, you need a job. The place where you find jobs is down in the flats where the factories were. So they took him down to the flats, and Wilczek records that he looked at the river and he was absolutely disgusted. It was oily, it was scummy, it bubbled, it smelled. And he looked at his relatives who had been here, and they turned to him and said, Frank, you're not in Bohemia anymore. Around the same time, a Scottish family was having a boat ride on the river. And this is a letter found in the archives in Edinburgh, and the boat tipped over. And the letter home was, we've never felt so filthy in our life. But water was here to be used. It was here to be drunk. Eventually, Cleveland would have to chlorinate and filter its water in the early 20th century to make it palatable. We kept going further out to get water. The river burned through the 20th century, didn't worry about it. Today, we look, I've heard boating mentioned, I've heard, lawns in Phoenix. We look at water different ways as part of our image. That was always there, but it was only for a certain cadre of people. In the 19th century, if one looked at lakefront living, one would find the Perkins family had a beach, which we now call Edgewater Park. Mr. Gordon, who made his money in wholesale groceries, had his estate and private park called Gordon Park. Mr. Wade had a park out in what is University Circle, built along a tributary out to the lake called Doan Brook. And so these areas were sort of private enjoyment of water during a romantic period in which a lake view and access to bubbling brooks was someplace you wanted to go. Now, I would argue that what happened is this love of water, this use of water, became democratized. So Gordon's Park and Wade's Park and Perkins Park eventually became part of our park systems. They became public beaches. They became public streams. And so it became apparent that enjoying water was something that we all should have the right to do. I'm fascinated by the fact that the boating and fishing, which are hobbies now. Cleveland and Ohio had a fishing industry. At one point in the 1880s, the annual take out of Lake Erie, mostly from the Western Basin, was 40 million pounds of fish a year commercially. By the 1920s, that had dropped to 20 million pounds a year. In 1970, the governor stopped commercial fishing in Lake Erie because of mercury poisoning, and the last commercial boat left Cleveland in 1973. But if I would fast forward, we now expect to boat and fish. And I think in the post-World War II era, this democratization of the use of water and the enjoyment of water increased in many ways. More people had boats. It was no longer the Cleveland Yacht Club, which started in 1878. Boating became a hobby, fishing became a hobby. Water became something that was absolutely necessary for more people rather than just drinking it. We come to that date in 1969. If the river had burned so many times before and nobody cared, I think the 1952 fire caused $1.2 million in damage. The 69 fire was minor compared to that. Why did it get attention? Because who we were as a people had changed. What we expected as a nation had changed. This is the period after Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. This is a period of increasing environmental awareness. This is a period in which Cleveland had an image problem, and when its river caught on fire again, that image was made further more negative. And so that, many people would argue, is one of the spurs for the modern environmental movement, this fire on Lake Erie. And the river is now cleaner. So we've changed our attitude toward water. We still drink it. We still use it for transportation.